All right, this is awkward. I'm back with the awkward interviews. I'm incredibly excited about my guest today. He is my favorite Twitter follow. He's the king of threads. And I think what makes it so is he really touches on people and people's lives. This isn't some scientific, systematic process for a guy who separates himself from the work he does and the people he helps. He tells real stories about real people, and I think that's the best way to really get people to pay attention, and it seems to be working. I'm going to try not to butcher his name. It's Alec Karakatsanis. And he's a civil rights lawyer, social justice advocate, and founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps, a Washington, D.C. impact litigation nonprofit. Before founding Civil Rights Corps, Alec was a civil rights lawyer and public defender with the Special Litigation Division of the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, a federal public defender in Alabama, representing impoverished people accused of federal crimes, and co-founder of the nonprofit Equal Justice Under Law. Alec's work targets the American monetary bail system using the strategy of suing jurisdictions under the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment. It's a pretty unique approach, and it's been incredibly successful. He's won a series of landmark civil rights lawsuits, which actually ended money bail systems in Mississippi, Missouri, Alabama, Kansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Georgia, and elsewhere. In 2016, Alec was awarded the Stephen B. Bright Award by Gideon's Promise for contributions to indigent defense in the South, and the Trial Lawyer of the Year Award by Public Justice for what they deemed setting the precedent for a new era of criminal justice reform in the age of mass incarceration. And I would go even further and say that this isn't criminal justice reform, as reforms typically strengthen the institution itself. And what Alec is doing is chipping away at the system. A step toward abolition is ending cash bail, and that's what he's doing. Alec's work at Civil Rights Corps challenging cash bail in California was also recently honored with the 2018 Champion of Public Defense Award by the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And a 2017 Harvard Magazine article describes Alec's work as putting human caging and wealth-based detention in America on trial. Alec focuses also on ending mass incarceration, ending the war on drugs, addressing surveillance, ending the death penalty, addressing immigration laws, ending war, and ending inequality. He's also the author of the book, Usual Cruelty. I'm incredibly excited. As I said, thank you for joining me, Alec.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Great, man. My pleasure. So I'll start off by just asking, why focus on the money bail system? How did you get inspired to target that area when you left school? And why do you think it's so important?
I was fascinated when I started working as a public defender in the system. I was fascinated by the assembly line nature of this bureaucracy, right? No society in recorded history of the modern world has ever attempted to take so many human beings from their schools and families and jobs and medical care and children, right? And put them into government-run cages. And when I became a public defender representing very poor people who were accused of crimes one after another, I saw how this assembly line functioned. And one of the main ways that it functions is by putting people in jail away from everything they hold dear in their lives, putting them in a desperate situation where they're at a very high risk of getting infectious disease, of being sexually and physically assaulted, of being deprived of sunlight and fresh air and nutritious food and all of the things that we all take for granted in our lives. I saw how the system coerces people into pleading guilty and pleading guilty fast by detaining them prior to trial. And across the country, almost all of that detention is solely because the person can't pay a monetary bail amount. So when I started doing this work, there were about 500,000 human beings in jail cells every single night in this country just because they can't pay cash bail. So I was thinking about how do we disrupt and dismantle that system. At the same time, I had started doing a number of civil rights cases around a slightly related but different issue, sort of the criminalization of poverty and the ways in which local police, prosecutors, and judges, and in many cases private companies, jail and threaten to jail people to collect debts from them. And so all over the country, hundreds of thousands of people were being jailed just because they couldn't pay debts that they owed from old tickets or other things, right? And so I was going around the country filing these lawsuits. I remember the first one I did, I met a woman in a jail in rural Alabama. And then I met another woman in a jail in rural Alabama. And then I met a third and the fourth and the fifth. And all of these women were being jailed because they owed debts from things like, fines from their kids not going to school, or old traffic tickets, or drug tests that they were charged for, but they couldn't afford to pay. And so one morning I was in a jail in Montgomery, Alabama, and I met Charnel Mitchell. And I opened my book, actually, Usual Cruelty, with Charnel's story. But when I met Charnel, there were 67 people in the courtroom in jail garb and shackles, and Charnel was one of them. All of them were Black. Not one of them was accused of a crime. They were all there because they owed debts to the city. And when I went up into the jail and I talked to Charnel, she said that her court document she showed me said that pay us $2,807 or do 59 days in jail. And she explained to me that in Montgomery, you could sit out your debt at $50 a day. But if you agreed to be a janitor for the city, you could sit out your debt at an extra $25 a day. You clean the feces and the blood and the mucus and the mold and the urine from the jailhouse floors where you're sleeping on top of all these other women. And so Charnel became my first client as a civil rights lawyer. And we filed a landmark class action lawsuit on behalf of her and then 15 other people that I ended up meeting in that community to challenge the idea that a human being can be put in a cage because she owes a monetary payment. And something really profound happened, when Charnel and the others came to court and told their stories. And by the way, Charnel had been separated from her two children, her 1-year-old and her 4-year-old. When the police raided her home and took her away for debts, she had no idea what happened to her kids, right? And when we won this case, instead of defending their system or explaining why the city was doing this, the city just released everybody from its jail on a single day. And that was a really profound moment for me because it highlighted just how desensitized our culture and particularly the bureaucracy of the legal system has become to human caging, something that should shock us to the core. And after we won Charnel's case, I went to Ferguson right after Michael Brown was killed. And I embedded myself with a lot of the people that were protesting in the streets and fighting that system and organizing against it. And we would have these amazing meetings in people's homes, and 10, 15, 20 people would show up in people's living room. Each of them would have their own story about how this same thing had happened to them. And it turned out that in Ferguson, the police averaged 3.6 arrest warrants for every household, almost all of them for Black people, almost all of them for unpaid debt. And so we sued Ferguson and a bunch of other cities around Ferguson, working with an amazing local organization called Arch City Defenders and others. And basically, the idea behind all of these cases is that all over the country, in all 50 states, people are being jailed because they can't make a monetary payment, and families are being separated. All kinds of traumatic and brutal things are happening. And as we were having a lot of success in those cases, it occurred to me that we could use the same legal theories, equal protection and due process, to apply these cases about people not paying their debts. We could apply those same principles to the American money bail system, in which people are jailed before they're ever convicted of anything while they await trial just because they can't pay. And so beginning in 2015, in the first 10 months of 2015, we filed 12 class action lawsuits working with 12 different groups of people in different cities, challenge the US money bail system. So, the short answer to your question is we started bringing these cases to liberate people, but and to change the way the system exerts power over people pre-trial to coerce them to pleading guilty. But also, to me, there was something much more profound and more abolitionist about this work, which is that we are helping in a small way a broader movement of people who are telling a story about the purpose of our legal system, the purpose of police, the purpose of prosecutors, the purpose of judges, that is really different from the story that they tell us, right? And one of the most powerful things to say to people is, if these judges, prosecutors, police, wealthy elites, if they are determining who's in a jail cell separated from their kids and who's home with their family on the basis of how much money they have, how can we trust anything else they're doing? And I think that is a really subversive narrative piece that underlies a lot of our challenges to the money system.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that stat about Ferguson is completely insane. I'm curious how many other towns and cities it's like that. Yeah, I mean, and then, that 75% of the people in jail, like you said, are legally innocent. And that's a stat that, I don't think people, and I think that's shocking to people. People, like you said, the propaganda, the disinformation we're fed, the scare tactics from tough on crime politicians and the mainstream media is that, we're putting people, a lot of people don't even know the difference between jail and prison, but we're putting people away to protect those of us who are, who should feel safe, and who should be safe, when in reality, the number of people who have committed crimes is far greater than the number of people who have been criminalized or incarcerated or jailed. So could you expound upon two things? One, you talked a little bit about the horrific experience of having your home raided, losing your kids, and then what it's like to be in jail. Can you tell me more about, once you're in the system, what does that mean for someone? What does that mean for their family? And also, how you think, and you touched on this as well, how you think race and class intersect in, in determining who are those people who are targeted by police and pushed into that system.
Absolutely. So as you sort of hinted at, one of the main features of the policing and prosecution and court system that is not commonly well understood is that almost all of the decisions in that system are based on who has power, who has wealth, and on race, right? And so, for example, it's illegal in this country to possess certain substances that are on a list of substances you can't possess. A lot of people don't understand that when opium was criminalized in order to give police more discretion to target Chinese American immigrants. Marijuana was criminalized with the express purpose of giving police more discretion to target Mexican American immigrants. Cocaine was criminalized with the express purpose of giving police in the South more discretion to target Black people. At every juncture, including for the entire history of the war on drugs, elites and wealthy people know that they are not going to be targeted for those laws. So where I went to school, Yale and Harvard, right, there was rampant underage drinking, rampant drug use all over the place, right? There was never anyone had any worry that the police were going to raid their dorm room with SWAT teams, et cetera, right? Everyone understood that the SWAT teams were for the poor Black neighborhood right down the street. So right off the bat, like when we criminalize things, what we're actually saying is we want to give the police more power and discretion to have another set of tools with which they can try to control and oppress and cage and brutalize the people in our society who don't have power. So in my book, I go through hundreds of examples from all over the criminal law, from the fact that tax evasion laws are not enforced, from the fact that it used to be illegal to gamble on certain derivatives, and a bunch of elites paid the Democratic Party a bunch of money in the 1990s, and Clinton ended up legalizing various forms of derivative trading, which used to be illegal gambling, which then made people billions of dollars and actually led to the financial crisis, right? At the same time, it was illegal and people were being arrested all over the country, poor people, for wagering dice in the streets, right? So I could go on and on about these examples, but the point is that what elites decide to make a crime, and then given what's a crime, where do they try to enforce those laws, right? It's important to understand that the police are only enforcing some laws against some people some of the time in some places. And the decisions about who to enforce laws against are based on who has power and who doesn't. So once you are into the system, you are into a system whose purpose is not public safety or community flourishing or well-being, right? The purpose of the war on drugs isn't to lower drug use, right? Think about the war on drugs. We've spent trillions of dollars. We've caged tens of millions of people for marijuana possession alone and tens of millions of more for other drugs. We've separated tens of millions of little children from their families. We have put people in cages for hundreds of millions of years. We've even carpet bombed Latin America and millions of acres of land with chemical sprays that gives people cancer and destroys cropland and rainforest. We've surveilled the communications of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world, all to fight this war on drugs. And yet, drug usage rates are higher than they were before the war on drugs started. Kids are using dangerous drugs at larger rates. More people are overdosing, right? It's not that the people that developed the war on drugs are stupid. It's not that they don't understand these statistics. It's that their purpose was never to reduce drug use or to create a society of health and safety. Their purpose was to control people. So once you're brought into this system, you are now, they are able to control your body. They're to put you in a cage, take you away from your family, to control your labor. They're making money off your labor in jails and prisons, right? Once you're even out of jail, out of the system, you're on probation, you're on parole, right? You're reporting to them, you're paying them fees. Anything that you do that doesn't follow the rules that they give you, you can be sent back to jail and prison. And that's how we develop a society now where there are twice as many people on probation and parole than there are in prison. And there are more Black people on prison, in probation, parole, and in prison than there were enslaved at the height of slavery. So these systems have a different purpose than the one they're given to us.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to ask you about next. One of these great reforms that was touted on both sides of the aisle was an alternative to prison, which was like imprisonment at home, full-time monitoring, and electronic ankles and all of those things. And do you believe that this, and then I'm sure you've experienced this with some of your clients, they've talked about this, for some people that, and often like you also mentioned earlier, the way they're kind of coerced into pleading for lesser sentences and things like that. They're given this alternative option, and it's like, it sounds better than being in prison because you can at least be at home. So what has your experience been with this alternative that actually, as you said, just increased the surveillance state and control?
It's such an important question. So when you look at the history, and this is really what the book that I wrote, Usual Cruelty, is trying to get at. If you look at the history of these systems, everything that we've been sold as a reform is actually a way of making the system stronger and giving the system more power to control it. So probation is a really good example. Pretrial supervision, electronic monitoring are really good examples, right? Parole is a really good example. By the way, probation and parole make a lot of use of this new sort of electronic monitoring sort of industry that has cropped up. What Michelle Alexander has called incarceration, right? And what the incredible organizer and activist James Kilgore is doing a lot of great work to stop. Each of these systems actually enables the government to control you at lower cost, to control larger numbers of people, and to keep shoveling people back into prison at sort of the back end. What a lot of people don't know is that 25% of all admissions to prison in the US are technical violations of probation and parole. Understand what that means. That means these are people who have not even been accused of committing a new crime. It's someone who broke a rule or is accused of breaking a rule, like, have a job or don't associate with people who have been convicted of crimes, or report to us, every week at 10 o'clock a.m., or someone who tested positive for alcohol in the system or tested positive for marijuana. Those are the most common violations. that is a quarter of all people being sent to prison.
And just think about like the likelihood of those things happening, right? You come out and you have a record and you're supposed to find a job. You live in a community that has been criminalized and you can't be around anyone else who has been arrested and charged or whatever it is. Everyone, I mean, forgetting marijuana even, but alcohol is legal. Can't have that. Let's say you do find a job, you do avoid everyone else who has been, convicted of a crime, and you're being asked to leave work at your new job to go meet a requirement at 10 in the morning. You're going to get fired probably. And then, there's the fact that they are actually charged for their own monitoring. What if they don't have a job, or what if the job doesn't pay well? How they can go back for not paying the fee to have their ankle monitoring, right? It's totally crazy. And I didn't know that stat about it being 25%. That's mind blowing.
And we have been challenging this all over the country. We've actually brought some RICO cases. RICO is a statute that was meant for the mafia, organized crime. We've actually brought some RICO challenges to these systems where these private companies start supervising you on probation, and they tell you, if you don't pay us the monitoring fees and the other fees and the drug test fees, we're going to have you jailed. And so what we said in our federal court cases is that's just extortion, right? Threatening to put someone in a cage away from their families if they don't pay you money is extortion. And a pattern of extortion is racketeering, right? And this is an enterprise that is engaging in racketeering. And so we actually won a big case on behalf of tens of thousands of people in Tennessee on a private probation case, which got $14.3 million back for those people who'd had this extortion scheme applied to them. And we just last week settled another case to get rid of for-profit privatized probation in another county in Tennessee. But I'll have to say, I mean, Georgia is the world leader in this. The state of Georgia has 2 to 3 to 4 times as many people on probation as other states, and almost all of it is privatized. And it's a huge, huge problem at every juncture in this system. That it's not happening by accident. There are very particular interests that are making money off of every single element of the system, including the very basic act of wanting to call your family when you've been locked up.
Yeah.
Right. There's now multi-billion-dollar a year industry around that, and the biggest company is owned by the same person who owns the Detroit Pistons.
Yep.
And that company, owned by the Detroit Pistons, right, the same person, entered into these sort of kickback contracts with jails all over the country, where they said, if you eliminate in-person visits so people can hug and see their families, we believe people will give us more money for phone calls and video calls. And we'll give you a cut of that money if you eliminate people's ability to hug their children. That is the kind of evil we're dealing with. That is the kind of intentional brutality that these companies are inflicting, and that most people don't even know about.
Yeah, it's staggering. And, and you're right, like there is money in every part of it, from civil asset forfeiture to driving tickets, to these phone calls, and like you said too, it's the same companies that are profiting off of, the food that they're eating in prison. These companies are also the ones donating to the politicians and to the police foundations. So it's so incredibly powerfully ingrained. I just have to applaud you for, not only how hard you work at trying to, one step at a time, tackle these issues, but also the creativity. I couldn't help but smile when you talked about the RICO cases, because I would never have thought of that, but that, it is exactly what you say it is. And using it for that purpose is just, it's exciting to me. So of course, this is also pretty daunting, and knowing that this is intentional every step of the way, that's why we probably celebrate things like Biden saying he wants to end private prisons. Of course, when you say you want to end private prisons, you're strengthening the system of state and federal prisons in a couple ways, because one, you're not questioning the validity of caging people as the solution, and all of those who are in private prisons would just be transferred to state or federal prisons that also profit in other ways. And the George Floyd Act, which everyone's celebrating while ignoring the Breathe Act, gives $750 million more to police and wouldn't even make what killed George Floyd illegal. So how do we, how does someone who wants to get involved, who isn't an attorney and can't do the work that you're doing, and what do we as a society, or the members of this society who see the evil in this and the inequality and injustice in this, work to actually continue to chip away at this system toward a more humanist society, an alternative without cops in cages?
I think that the answer is going to be really, really different for different people. And I just have my own perspective, and this perspective is really informed by my work with people who are most directly impacted by these systems, people organizing and building power against them around the country. I'll offer a couple of thoughts, but these aren't in any way sort of a complete answer. They're just thoughts. I think that the number one principle in my mind is we need to be shrinking the size of these systems. So, transferring people from private prisons to state-run prisons, it doesn't even eradicate the profit motive, because almost everything that happens in state-run prisons is privatized for profit. Medical care, phone calls, food service, labor, right? So, and many of the same companies sort of, and investors like own all of those different companies, right? It is good to eliminate for-profit prisons. It is good to eliminate all of the different ways in which the pursuit of profit has corrupted the sort of basic delivery of our legal system, but it's by no means sufficient. And so the more appropriate principle is, how do we figure out how to shrink every element of the system? That's one of the reasons why defunding the police is so important. All of these other reformers keep talking about more money for training and more money for body cameras. You have to understand, that's exactly what the police want. That's what the police have been saying after every major incident of police brutality in the last several decades. They've been saying, oh, we were unprepared, we made mistakes, we need better training, right? We need more resources, we need better technology, right? It's all part of their plan, right? Police wanted body cameras. Why? Because they are an outward-facing camera that police control, that they can use as evidence in any case that they want. It's a surveillance tool. Their plan was to combine body cameras with street-based surveillance cameras, and then even linking to things like Amazon's Ring database to try to get as much video as they can of every place in the country, and then to link that with new cloud computing databases by companies like Amazon and Palantir and Microsoft. Link all this together with facial recognition software and voice recognition software, and turn this into even more of a police state. That was their goal. They had a problem though. They couldn't get the billions of dollars that it would take to equip every cop with a camera that cop controls. So what do? They partnered with fancy liberal reformers to convince people that a response to their own violence and brutality is giving them more money for things. So the number one rule in terms of like how we think about these systems is the particular reform that I'm being offered shrinking the size and power of the system? If it's not doing that, it's not worth supporting. And the second thing, people need to figure out different people with different skills and different backgrounds and different experiences with the system and different traumas are going to be playing really different roles in the system. But one really important thing is getting involved in your local community. Where are the groups that are working to decrease the size and power of police? Where are the groups that are building beautiful alternatives to this? Mutual aid collectives in different cities, right? They're building the kinds of systems that are actually going to be there to hold people and make them safer and not destroy their lives, like the sort of violent policing systems, right? These systems of community-based violence interruption, community court watching programs that go in and actually watch what judges and prosecutors are doing and hold them accountable. community bail funds that are liberating people. These are the kinds of things you can get involved with in your own community that actually build connection between human beings and create the kinds of relationships that are going to, and infrastructure that are going to enable us to create alternatives to these systems of pain and profit and punishment.
Awesome. Thank you. So I guess, you know, I have to ask you this question that, I mean, this is what I hear all the time as an abolitionist myself. You know, it's the language. I have a problem with the language. They don't like the term defund the police, and certainly they don't like the because they can't wrap their heads around what abolition means. They think it is lawlessness. And so before we even get into abolition, you know, my answer is yes, I really do mean defund, and I also mean to zero, but that doesn't end there. That's step one. And as we're defunding, we're taking those billions of dollars and putting them into these other options that you're talking about. So what, just out of curiosity, if you hear that question or you hear that complaint, there is a degree of truth to the importance of branding and marketing when you're presenting something. But I'm not going to change my language to appeal to people who refuse to understand. So what is your response to that argument?
A few different responses. So number one, most of it is just bad faith. They're portraying a really deep political difference they have with what you're proposing as a mere matter of presentation and language. It's very similar to how people treated the Black Panthers, the civil rights movement. You know, Martin Luther King, as soon as he started talking about you know, more radical proposals that actually touched on class as well, right? There was this, like, and people don't really remember, but he was one of the most hated figures in the country. He was hated by white liberals. He himself wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail that the greatest threat was not the KKK, but the white moderate, right? And that is because there's this constant sort of moderate liberal force that says, oh, okay, you know, we vaguely agree with some of the things you're trying to get to, but like, we don't like your tactics. We think it's too much too soon. You know, it's not effective. You know, there's a whole industry out there of police reformers that are doing, basically, they're fulfilling the exact same historical role. They're competing for very well-meaning people that don't want police violence to continue, that don't like the system of mass human caging, but that don't quite understand yet how we might be able to fix it. And there's all these sort of moderate liberal police reformers out there saying, oh, just trust us. The way to stop these bad things is more money for cops, more training, right? Without telling people that we've been trying that for many, 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 many decades. And in fact, it appears that the very purpose of police since their inception has actually been to combat these social movements. It's a real propaganda move. So my response is, look, let's talk about these policies on their merits. And after studying these issues for a long time, the only thing I can think of is ratcheting down their power. In the same way we ratcheted up their power, we gave all these companies and police and prosecutors and probation unions and corrections officer unions, right? We gave them so much power because we funneled so many billions of dollars into them. They now help control the political system. Reducing their budgets, even if we reduce this, you know, even if there's a local campaign to reduce the budget by 10% and to invest that money in poetry teachers and music classes and athletic programs for kids and mutual aid infrastructure, that's a system that is now has 10% less money to dole out to contracts for corporations and police unions, et cetera. It's 10% less powerful, right? Maybe year one, we do 10%. Year two, we get it down to their funding levels from 2010, right? Keep in mind, this still means a system that is way less funded than in any other place in the world. Canada, Europe, South America, Mexico, right? We're just talking about things that should not be radical at all. What's radical is the incredible amount of money that we're currently spending. I mean, I was just reading this article about this Oakland cop who makes over $600,000 a year when you add all the overtime and stuff in, right? And like, when you look at the fraud, waste, and abuse in police department budgets, it's hard to imagine any reasonable person thinking that we can't shrink those budgets significantly. So I think we should have a, yes, we should push back on people's attempts to make the conversation something about just pure language, but also we should be really clear that like um, we don't need to get the police budgets to zero tomorrow. We're talking about a gradual process of significant reductions in their budgets, and if we make the right investments, and this is what the Breathe Act is all about, if we actually invest in the kind of things that help communities with their health, safety, and wellness, everyone will understand that we don't need the police at all.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about abolition, abolition does not mean taking our society exactly how it looks and just removing all the prisons and jails and police, right? People think that would be chaos. Abolition is about creating these other beautiful systems and ways of connecting to each other that make things like tasers and guns and handcuffs and cages and prisons and jails and prosecutors and judges and cops less necessary, and maybe not even necessary at all.
Yep, 100%. And I think that's the most persuasive argument that I make, is just correcting that confusion of it's not happening tomorrow. We are in no place in our society today to remove cops in cages. It would be a disaster. This happens over time. And that's why the 10 demands that I created is the road to abolition, because there's a ton of dismantling, major chipping away of the system steps, not incremental, non-helpful reforms, but real changes that would create this alternative society to the point where we really don't need the cops in cages. And despite all of the, what I believe to be fantastic arguments that I make, I still get some pushback. And, there's the typical one of like, what about rapists and murderers? To me, that's a really simple, there's a lot of reasons why that's not a legitimate argument. And it, primarily it's because that is the smallest proportion of people, of crimes and people who are incarcerated to begin with. But there are a couple that make me think a little bit more. And I'm just curious, maybe we can end on this. Like, what are your thoughts when people say, for instance, we have set up these alternative mechanisms. We now have free healthcare, free substance abuse treatment, free mental health treatment. And some people just simply can't be cured, so to speak. They can't protect themselves, and they can't necessarily be trusted to be safe around others without patient services. How do we keep them and us safe without locking them away?
Yeah, so let me first just say, and I was actually debating the Houston police chief before the pandemic, and he made similar points. And he was basically saying, you don't understand that we live in the most dangerous society in world history, and all this danger all the place. We need to like, cage people. And I said to him, well, if what you're saying is true, and I have no reason to believe it's true that we live in the most dangerous society in world history, but if what you're saying is true, wouldn't that mean that we've just spent trillions of dollars on police cages, prosecutors, and judges, and we still live in the most dangerous society in world history? Yes. More dangerous than it was 40 years ago before we started investing all of this money. And he had no response to that, right? Because at a fundamental level, police and jails are not a response. They don't actually, first of all, the vast majority of people who are sexually or physically harmed don't even go to the police because they don't believe the police have anything to offer them. The police don't even find out about it.
Those that do, that it doesn't work. There's more than 250,000 rape kits just sitting there, never tested.
Right. I mean, the police have not prioritized that. Sexual violence has never been a priority of the police, nor does anyone I know think that the police are the way of solving it. And by the way, I mean, unless you're prepared to lock someone up in solitary confinement for the rest of their lives, right? The people that you cage and the people that you brutalize are coming back into the community.
Yeah.
And so that's why other countries that don't adopt this approach, like Norway, for example, has the lowest recidivism rates in the world. But they don't use things like what we think of as maximum security prisons, and they don't use solitary confinement and etc. So look, I mean, it's a thorny question of what to do with people who cannot or won't control their behavior and are pose an imminent risk to other people. That sort of communal societies throughout world history have dealt with that problem in ways that don't involve human cages. It's just a fact.
Okay.
And so I'm not the person to provide all the answer to that, and I will agree with you. That is, we could abolish 99% of the entire criminal punishment system, and still, not agree on, this 1%. So like, there are some people that think we should abolish 99% of the system, but still have prisons for that 1%, right? For me personally, I just don't think that'll be effective, and I don't think it's an appropriate way. And I think that all of that harm is caused by people who've been traumatized and harmed themselves. And if we create a society that doesn't have those same kinds of traumas and harms and environmental toxins that change people's brain chemistry, like lead, we won't have those kinds of people. But even if we did, we could work with them and sequester them from the rest of society for brief periods of time in ways that don't look anything like our current prison system.
Yeah.
In ways that are much more restorative. And so it will be interesting to see a society that meaningfully cared about reducing sexual violence and harm and physical violence and poverty and all the structural violence that goes along with it. If we had a society that cared about that, a lot of people would be working together to build the kinds of connections and relationships with other people that prevent them from harming people.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how I would answer it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, the beginning of your response is exactly what they tell, people, the critics tell me we do. We talk about what isn't working. We don't provide solutions. You then went on to provide some thoughts on like what a solution could be. And I was going to challenge you if you didn't, because I'm used to I'm the one who gets challenged all the time. But also I think it was important that the way that you think about things and your nature, you're willing to say, I don't have all the answers, and that's okay. Like I as an individual, you as an individual may not have all of the answers, but a lot of this takes imagination and working together. And I think that as long as we build, new mental health facilities for this 1% that does not mimic the ones of old that were shut down and don't mimic prisons, then, as long as they're not carceral, they're not punitive, we created this concept of mass incarceration. We can create something else.
Absolutely. And we also have to understand that the world is always going to carry some risk with it. The existing system is extraordinarily risky. I mean, we let people smoke, right? Even though smoking kills 450,000 Americans every year, it kills 50,000 people from secondhand smoke alone, right? There's all kinds of other risks that we're willing to tolerate in our society. Like it's a risk every time I get in the car to drive somewhere, right? Texting while driving kills more people than murder, right? So these are all risks. But like, we're never going to be able to get to a society of zero risk. All we can do is how do we treat each other and support each other and build the kinds of real human connection that don't alienate people, that minimize any forms of violence and coercion in our society. And other societies throughout the world have done that throughout history fairly well. And so are we ever going to get to a world where we can guarantee that every single person will be safe every single day? No, and that shouldn't be our goal. And the police are never going to get us to that goal in the first place.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to understand that what we're trying to do is maximize human flourishing, not eliminate every single bad thing that could ever happen.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, closing out. A lot of what you do is work within the legal system, in creative ways to make significant changes. There are people who are on the streets protesting. There are people organizing and strategizing lists of demands, and then, you know, distributing them to those who are who are scheduling meetings with city councils. What are your thoughts on elected officials? You know, as we saw with the squad, you know, no one's acknowledging the Breathe Act, and they've done a lot of other things that have been disappointing as well. There are some down ballot progressives, or however you want to phrase it, who still have a D next to their name, who are abolitionists, who we at 10 Demands have supported, and I have supported individually. And then I have people responding to me like they're a fraud. If there's a D next to their name, not voting for them, they're going to sell out. End of story. And yet it seems, currently at least, the viability of a third party option is still rather weak. So what role can elected officials have in implementing actual changes like those included in the 10 Demands, like changing laws, you know, not relying on lawyers to do it, but actually in the legislative process, making changes that are not incremental reforms, but real fundamental change?
I think this is a really important question. I'll try to be as clear as I can be. I'm not a big fan of electoral politics, nor do I put any faith in politicians. What I do think is absolutely vital is organizing. I think if you actually are building real power, those elected officials will have no choice but to listen to you. And so to the extent that one way of organizing and building power is around electoral campaigns, that seems like a fine tactic to me. But all of these people are accountable to power. And if you build enough power, no matter what their personal views are or what their background is, they're going to change their views and they're going to listen to you, right? We saw that with the, you know, for just to take one example, like complete sea change in the way that elected officials talked about same-sex marriage. Did they all become better people and they all just have an epiphany? No, our culture changed the way that it thinks about same-sex marriage. It became untenable for elected officials to talk the way Obama did in his first presidential race about same-sex marriage, right? We need something similar. And throughout history, you know, things that we're seeing something similar now with the criminal justice reform movement. It's no longer okay for these people to just do Willie Horton ads all the time, right? They have to sort of pretend like they care about mass incarceration and racial justice. That's because of organizing and power building led by people who've been impacted by the system. That's how change happens. The other thing that I'll note is far more important than electoral organizing. People are often always talking about, like, you know, your vote mattering, et cetera, et cetera. It's always been really odd to me. I think that democratizing the workplace is a much more important development than sort of purely political voting, right? If workers in each of their organizations voted to unionize, or if we set up worker-owned co-ops where they actually own the political capital or the economic capital they're building, that actually leads to more political engagement, involvement, and relationship, and better organized groups of workers. I guarantee you, if you actually focus on democratizing the workplace, all of the politics will follow, because that's where the power is. So when people talk about voting in elections, I think they're often sort of misplacing. It's not about electing someone who's going to be really good. It's about building the power that makes sure that whoever is elected is going to do the things that you want them to do. And a lot of that focus should be not on the political sphere, but on the workplace and economic sphere. That's sort of my concluding thought.
No, great points. You know, I lobbied New York State Congress and protested in Albany for the repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws, and it worked, not because of me, but because of a massive effort. And the politicians had to make that change, but they didn't make the change, like you said, because they had an epiphany. It's because we were up their ass. And I'll just close by saying that we are working. I have been working on this since April. The possibility of a general strike, it goes hand in hand with what you're saying with building power in the workplace. Any thoughts on that? I mean, it wasn't something I was thinking of asking you, but since you brought up democratizing the workplace and unions, and we have a meeting with Sarah Nelson, who's a big union figure. And, like Christian Smalls said, like it would take just a couple days for us staying home, not being out risking our safety, staying home to bring all of these billionaires to their knees. And yet we can't do it. It hasn't happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main goals of the criminal punishment system of mass incarceration, of the broader set of neoliberal policies that created it, one of the main goals is to isolate us as individuals, to isolate us into these little atomic family units, to destroy all of the aspects in our society that build connection between people, because people who are isolated and distracted are easier to manipulate. And so they want us to stop being able to organize together. And this is one of the reasons why I mentioned earlier, I think mutual aid, local community mutual aid organizations are just so important, because that is how we're building back those connections to other human beings. And we need to get organized. And we're just nowhere near the point in our society yet where something like a general strike, or even like coordinated strikes, which are actually illegal, right? Wildcat strikes. And like, we're not at the point where we're not even ready for that kind of thing yet. We need to get back to the basics of organizing and building connection. If we try to move too fast, I think that the forces we're up against are too powerful.
Thank you. That's great advice. I'm going to go into that meeting saying but prioritizing further what I was going to say. That was so weird. Sorry. What I was going to say, which was that mutual aid is essential to this. We couldn't do this without mutual aid, but I think your pessimistic view is probably an appropriate pessimism. And for however long it is necessary, we need to focus on building these mutual aid networks to get to the point. Same with abolition. We have to get to the point where we can actually do it. Awesome. This was really great, man. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your work and all of your thoughts.
Wonderful to be here.
All right.
Talk soon.
Yep. See ya.